Good afternoon. Welcome to the PSI EFSPI webinar on data sharing and data privacy, what every statistician needs to know. I'm Ray Harris from PSI. I'm the chair for this session. I think you'll find it as a very interesting session, so welcome to it. Just to remind you, a few housekeeping details. All attendees are on mute. The presenters welcome questions, so please type them into the chat window on the drop down on the right, and the speakers will deal with them at the end of both sessions. So we'll go through the two sessions and then deal with the questions. It's also being recorded with your the email you were sent with the link. It indicated where you could find the recording in due course and where you can find the slides in due course. So I hope you enjoy this session. So I'll introduce the first two speakers. We have two sessions and two speakers for each. So the first speaker will be Janice Branson from Novartis. She's Global Head of Biostatistics for Immunology and Dermatology franchise at Novartis and based in Basel. She's been in Basel for 16 years from Novartis, from early development into integrated hospital care to head the stats group in respiratory, and then took on her current role in 2015. She was with Pfizer before joining Novartis as a master's in biometry from Reading, and she's actively involved in the clinical data transparency and is the statistics lead for this in Novartis cross-divisional team, as well as a member of the PSI EFSPI working group. The other speaker is also from Novartis for this first session. Dr. Nicola Orlandi is Head of Data Privacy Pharma in Novartis. Dr. Orlandi works with the various business groups within Novartis with accountabilities to build scientific and business expertise in order to fully understand data privacy and its related business needs, to assess business strategy and projects, as well as project proposals with regard to arising data privacy challenges, and provide associated legal counseling. You can see on the screen at the moment the thanks to the EFSPI Data Sharing Working Group and the acknowledgement. So our thanks to these individuals for their work in making this happen. So I will now hand over to Janice, who will present the first talk. Over to you, Janice.
Hello, Ray. It's not Janice, it's Nicola.
Okay.
We have changed the order in the presentation, so I'm going to start and then leave the stage to Janice for the second part of the presentation. First of all, thank you to EFSPI for the invitation for this webinar. So let's start. Just a second, I'm trying to move forward with the slides. Okay, perfect. So this first presentation is related to data privacy aspects of anonymization, what a statistician should know, I mean, as you can see. And I mean, let me have a first sort of introduction about what are, here you can see the agenda. So we have 3 points: why a systematic approach to anonymization is important for pharmaceutical companies. Then we will enter more in detail on the legal requirements in EU, in US, and also in Switzerland, since Novartis is a Swiss-based company, but just to see how these can be aligned, these different approaches, but can be substantially aligned. And then the third point in the agenda is the possible approach. I mean, so starting with the first point, I think it's important to highlight initially that we are moving in a new era for the use of health data, where the secondary use, the reuse of individual patient data will have an increasing role and in modernizing healthcare system, driving innovation and fostering better patient outcomes. So we will have more and more new data from trials, but also from other and new sources like devices, social media, app, any other kind of tools that can enable companies or in general entities to collect personal data from patients or even from individuals not yet, let's say, patient in the classical definition. And in some cases, it's important to, in any case, it's important to collect data in the right way, to be able to protect data and to share data or even use data internally. And then it's important to have the appropriate safeguards and measures in place, and anonymization, just to move to the point we are going to discuss, is for sure one of those measures, one of those important points to be considered in a pharma company. And for sure it's important that we will have a systematic approach to privacy management, and as I said, the identification of health data is a key in this approach in view of optimizing the value of health data for scientific research and for responding to the demand of transparency. Just some example, I mean, of the new changes. Here we are mentioning, as you can see in the title, big data analysis, and then we will talk about also real-world evidence analysis that are maybe more tailored on pharma industry. So we will have, we are going to have an evolution in clinical trials, so digital solution to improve trial administration and enhance patient experience and outcomes. We are going to interact in a completely different way with the individual, with patients. So digital innovation are aimed to use to support and to aid in patient care and to help identify and deliver on big trends. And then in some countries we will have a clear focus on the outcomes, and especially where we will have reimbursement of the drugs at healthcare level, healthcare system level. We will have to be able to prove the impact of a disease or of a drug in the daily life of a patient, also in the cost of an healthcare system. And then in order to do that, it's important to have the right set of data, and then the anonymization again will play a relevant role on that. In fact, I mean, just a summary of a list of the players interested in collecting and reusing data. So government agency, Europe, outside of Europe, payers, academia, accountable care organization, hospital, pharmacies, and obviously also industry. One point that is common to all those players is the fact that we have to consider, we have to preserve the data utility, meaning the quality and the reliability of data in order to perform additional analysis for scientific research or for any future use of data. And this has to be done obviously in line with the need and the obligation really to protect patient data and the rights of the individuals. There is, in any case, an increase in demand for transparency, since, as we know, and here we have just listed a few cases that were, I mean, known in the past, publicly known in the past, but where I mean, finally they were used by the authority, by the public opinion, in order to ask for more transparency by the industry, by the pharma sector, for with reference to the information about a new drug, the way that is followed in order to have the final approval of a drug, and in any case, in order transparency on what a company is doing with the patient data. So it's a privacy obligation. It's also a transparency, I mean, need and a transparency obligation that was a real important, I mean, question and requirement from the public opinion, and then obviously also from the institution. This was the way really, I mean, one of the reasons also for having the transparency policy, like the one just issued by EMA, in general for any transparency initiative. What is important here is, I mean, one slide, just to say that a systematic approach to anonymization or the identification is key to preserve the full value of, here we say, the real-world evidence analysis, but in general to secondary use, I would say, and to respond to transparency expectations, since this will help this combination of data utility, and the protection of individual rights is important in order to have improved patient outcomes, to have to manage in a better way our clinical trials, to have an improved healthcare, meaning better quality of care, increasing of efficiency, sustainable healthcare system, since this will allow to the companies and the healthcare system to focus on what is really crucial, on what is, the real need also from a patient point of view. And then obviously the transparency is intended also to build trust among all the different players in the pharma world and with the public opinion. So there is a clear societal expectations that the personal data will be used in a personal manner, will be used in a responsible manner. Sorry. And then what does mean in concrete to move to the identification, to use the anonymization, I would say, in order to make possible to have an additional use of data. So what is anonymization, first of all? Here we have, you can see in the blue box, the definition that is normally used, I would say, by European authorities. That is the one that is included in the documents from the authority, or the meaning of the anonymization that is included in the current applicable directive, and even in the text of the regulation that was approved last year, that will enter into force in May 2018, so not so far from now, so 11 months. Anonymization is finally a process where all direct or indirect identifiers are removed, so that a data set by itself will no longer identify an individual data subject, and is also unlikely to allow an individual data subject to be identified also in combination with data from other sources. So it's a way to remove the identifiers, in other words, from a set of data, in order to limit or eliminate, but let's see more in detail in the next slide, the risk of re-identification. If this process is done correctly, and obviously if data will be collected in line, in the first place, in line with the applicable data protection laws, what will result, so the resulting data will be no longer subject to data protection. So it will allow to process data for additional uses with no additional consent from the individuals, with no restrictions, I would say, in general, and for a secondary use of data. Obviously, if done correctly, so the first three words in the orange box is exactly where we have to focus, since the process for processing, for anonymizing data is a crucial point in order to be sure that internally we have the right approach, and that we will be able to share data also with other institutions, or even publish data as in the EMA Transparency Initiative. So we all know, and there is a huge discussion that really it's difficult to achieve what we say the full anonymization, meaning the fact that the zero risk of identification, since we have to consider different types of data, the potential combination of data, including and also in reference to the size of the data set, since if we talk about rare disease is completely different if we talk about a disease, not rare disease, where the risk of identification probably is different, is lower than for rare diseases. So, but it's a point to consider, and it's important to consider if we have other data available, and then possibly combined with the resulting anonymized data set, since these could potentially add additional risks or additional elements in order to raise or increase the risk of identification. And then we have to consider that we are in a very changing world from an IT, from a technical point of view. So what is not possible or not even, thinkable today probably will be easy to do in 1 year or in 2 years, or maybe even less, who knows. And the risk of combination of identification and then identification of data based on some, I don't know, algorithms or any other technical aspects will be even more. So it's important to see that if we want to consider to move forward with anonymization, considering also the need to preserve, as I said, the data quality, it's important to move to a risk-based approach in order to understand exactly what we want to reach, and with data, with anonymization, where we are going to store or with whom we are going to share the data, in order to be sure that we are following the right approach. But first of all, acknowledging that certain identification risk may remain despite all the effort to minimize them. So it's something we have to accept, but it's not a way to say that I think we have to accept that we can do more. It's exactly the opposite, I would say. We have to do our best effort always, and not once, in order to be sure that our anonymization approach is fine, and then we have to reassess in order to see that the data set is fine also in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years. So it's not it's not a one-shot solution for the anonymization. Moving to the very, short analysis and summary of what is the current approach, we can say that in EU, so especially we having in mind the GDPR, the new regulation coming next year, the approach is focused on the efforts necessary to identify a person. So the definition in one of the recital of the regulation is that we have to consider all the means reasonably likely to be used in order to identify an individual. So it's a way to say, and this is also confirmed in one European Court of Justice decision that was issued December last year on this point, that we have to have a sort of clear assessment of the risk, and we have to consider that if we are using all the means reasonably likely to be used, and we are not able to identify, there is no chance to identify, we have to accept that these data can be in some way defined as anonymous. It's called the relative approach, in opposite to the absolute approach to the anonymization. It's a way to say that we have always assessed, but we have also to consider that we can accept a risk, the risk of identification. That is, if you see in the second bullet point of this slide, the approach that is also included, in addition to other criteria, to the Article 29 Working Party document on the anonymization techniques. This is a document issued by the network of the Data Privacy Authority 3 years ago, so it was April 2014, especially on anonymization techniques, where it's a very important document and also very technical document, where the Working Party this network is listing all the some of the techniques that can be used in order to anonymize data, with pros and cons, and in order to limit the 3 main risks when we go to anonymization, meaning the singling out, the linkability, and the inference. But at the end of this document, when there is the final, the conclusions about how to approach in concrete anonymization, there is also a clear reference to the evaluation of the identification risk that has to be performed by the data controller, so the company defining the purpose for collecting and processing the data. And I think this is another important reference to be included here, since this document is, in addition to the criteria, in addition to the methodology, is also mentioning a reference to a risk-based approach. And you know, probably I'm sure you already know that this is the same wording used by EMA when defining the policy 070 for data transparency. Even more, let me just spend maybe 1 minute in the Swiss approach. Maybe it's not relevant for all of you, but it's a way to say that here, even more in an even more detailed way, I would say there is a reference to this risk-based approach, since in order to define if a data or a data set is anonymized, we have to consider if there is a technical information that permit the identification of the data subject, meaning an objective element, if there is even more a reasonable interest in undertaking the effort to make use of such means, meaning the subjective element, and finally we have to relate the data issue to the person, so that it's possible to link the data to other information known or otherwise likely available on the real person, so the reference data test. What does mean? That the combination of those three elements it's a way to confirm also from a Swiss point of view that a risk-based approach can be taken first, but it has to be taken having in mind all the three criteria, and with a clear governance, with a clear process in place by the company doing that. So it's not something that can be done in a simple way, as I said, with one exercise done once in the life and never more, but it's something that has to be done in a regular way with the anonymized data set. From a US point of view, the reference is the IPA rules, where the data identification is done also through the removal of 18 listed identifiers. Here we have to consider that there can be a conflict with the EU and Swiss rules, since these rules that are, that are defining a very pragmatic approach, probably they are not sufficient, or they do not fully address the EU and Swiss requirements. But I mean, just to give you an overview of EU, US, and the Swiss approach, and in order to say that in all of them there is a reference to a risk-based approach that is a possible solution we are going to explore, we are going to evaluate for the future. In line, and this is my last slide, the last slide of the first part of the presentation. This approach is in line with the industry standards, meaning in this case the EMA policy 70, and the guidance for the implementation of the policy, where EMA recommends a risk-based approach with a clear threshold identified as a suggestion in the guidance, in order to allow the publication of data in a public platform. So the suggestion is to have this approach, and I think this is in line with what we have just said. Now, in the next slides, we will see that in order to reach this objective and implement the EMA policy, but in order also to be in line with the legal requirements, it's important to define a clear criteria, to define a clear roles and accountability in order to perform anonymization of data sets. And here, on the possible approach, I will, move the screen to Janice.
Okay, thank you, Nicolai. So just to run through a few slides on a possible approach on anonymization based on what we've seen, what Nicola has shared. So when performing anonymization of the health data, when the purpose is for secondary use, we really want to look at this approach of using a risk-based and relative approach. And this is then in line with the EU, Swiss, and indeed the US and industry standards. For example, FEWS standards, we have those available, and considering the circumstances that might result in re-identification of data subject. In terms of the techniques to apply in such an approach, the Working Party 29 document has many techniques described in it, and it's not necessary to mandate one particular technique, and in fact a combination of techniques can be used. But really what we want to end up is have the aim to have the maximum degree of anonymization that also then facilitates the data use in context of secondary use. So for this possible approach, some measures to really maintain anonymization, and as Nicola mentioned several times, this is not a one-time test of risk of re-identification. But the purpose of this approach is really to mitigate the remaining risks of re-identification to the extent reasonably possible. And this has to be done on a case-by-case basis, really taking into considerations the context of the data you're sharing, new methods that may become available, new technology that becomes available, and indeed the secondary use of the anonymized data. So there's four elements here that really are advised to maintain anonymization. The first one being data sharing agreements. I think it's clear that we want to have these set up and really have some text in a data sharing agreement that would oblige the third party to refrain from trying to re-identify patients. Then data protection policies and procedures to really ensure that relevant employees at an institute would refrain from any attempt to re-identify. Where possible, we also want to invoke control mechanisms. So where possible, really maybe have access to the data in a controlled environment. And finally, the fourth element is really the re-evaluation assessment, where, as we've said before, it's not a one-time check of re-identification, but because of the evolving methodology and the evolving technology and evolving and increasing availability of data, it's necessary to verify the risk assessment on an ongoing basis. So circumstances for consideration of such an approach, to which extent can the personal data at issue be anonymized? So I'm not going to read through all the elements here, but it depends on the context of the data collection, who's receiving the anonymized data, what are the other available public information sources, what are the potential links to other databases, and as Nicola earlier mentioned, whether it's rare diseases or not. So lots of different contexts that can impact and that we need to consider when we think about the risk of re-identification and also anonymization. And just to finish up with, then really for such an approach, we really need a framework in place that looks at the roles and responsibilities. It looks at the process for approval and then documentation. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, making sure we establish safeguarding and supervise and monitor the implementation and the compliance with our rules. In the process for approval, how do we receive the requests, how do we evaluate the requests, and how do we decide on the anonymization methodology and the techniques to be used. And finally then making sure that the assessments of the risk of re-identification, these decisions are approved and documented in a corresponding anonymization report to have the full tracking of what has been done for this process. So with that, it ends the first section of this webinar, and I pass over to Rebecca.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that presentation. And just to introduce the next speakers, they are Sally Hollis, who's Head of Statistical Consulting at FASTAR, which is a specialist CRO. She is also Honorary Professor of Clinical Trials at the University of Manchester. Sally's got over 25 years experience within medical stats at the NHS, academia and the pharma industry, and she was 12 years at AstraZeneca in a variety of roles across phase 2 and phase 3 and life cycle management. She's co-lead of EFSBI PSI Special Interest Group in Clinical Trial Data Sharing, which includes statisticians in the industry and academia. The first speaker, I think, will be Rebecca Sadler from Roche. She's global lead for patient-level data sharing at Roche and has worked previously as a drug development statistician for 25 years. She leads the EFSBI Data Sharing Working Group and is chair of the PSI External Affairs Committee. And before she starts, just to remind people, please put your questions in the chat window and they can be addressed at the end of this session. So, Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ray. And thank you very much for having us talk. So I'm going to start off, and we're going to take a slightly different tack to that covered by Janice and Nicola, in that you've heard the legal issues and the anonymisation issues about data sharing. We just want to talk a little bit more from the perspectives of being drug development statisticians working in this new environment of transparency. You've had the introduction from Ray as to who we are. So I think one of the key objectives we want to get out of this session is really give you some ideas and increase your knowledge of the data sources, the clinical trial information, where they are and how to access them, and also the sorts of things that you could use these new data sources for. And also I think another key factor is really going forward is that appreciation that really the work we do in our clinical trials today for particular research questions to put particular filings together in reality have a life beyond just that initial purpose for which they were designed. So I mean, as Nikolai mentioned, I think that the data transparency debate has been going on for many, many decades, and it probably reached a bit of a culmination around about 2013. And I think for a long time, there'd always been a certain amount of nervousness about sharing data. But I think we also need to appreciate that sharing is a bit of a two-way street, in that information that we're now sharing from patients of whom have given their time to contribute to these trials, is also a fantastic learning opportunity from a scientific thinking and development perspective. So really, you know, the glass is both half empty and half full when it comes to data sharing. And certainly I think, as I said before, that we need to generally have a new mindset in drug development, and maybe particularly in biostatistics, in that we need to be thinking about these new opportunities for using information from previous studies. So traditionally we all tend to go to publications and things that are out there to perhaps help understand how to design our trials, to get treatment effects and things like that. But there are other documents available now, clinical study reports, that will have a much, much more richer set of information that could be useful for us. And they also include information beyond just the numbers and the statistics that may also help us think about key operational aspects that we should be thinking about, particularly maybe when we're embarking on a new disease area. But I also think the challenges that that are there are really the fact that perhaps traditionally we thought about the documents we write and the information that we generate and communicate about within our clinical study reports is very much a conversation with the regulators. I think we need to be very conscious that going forward the audience for those documents is much wider, and really I think we need to think about that perhaps a little when we're actually working in our day-to-day jobs. So with that as a sort of introduction, I'll now pass over to Sally to carry on the presentation.
Thanks, Rebecca. So We've talked about a lot of changes over the last decade, and there's been a lot of spotlight on data sharing and transparency. This slide just highlights some key events, starting with the All Trials campaign that launched in 2013, which calls for all past and present clinical trials to be registered and their results reported. We really are making moves now towards that. The EMA has been really instrumental in pushing for increased data transparency, and the pharmaceutical industry have responded to this and made commitments to share clinical trial data. So I'm going to provide some more details shortly, specifically on the regulatory and pharmaceutical industry current positions on further slides, but I'll just mention a few more recent events. There have been broader initiatives than just regulators and industry. In 2015, the Institute of Medicine published a very extensive report which calls for fostering a culture where data sharing is the expected norm. And that provides a lot of considerations for how to maximise the benefits, minimise the risks, and overcome the challenges of sharing clinical trial data. And improvements are being made in that area, but there's still a lot of work to be done. There was a proposal in January last year from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors to mandate the sharing of patient-level data with the publication of clinical trial results in their member journals, and that includes the major general medical journals. Feedback was invited on that proposal. They got a lot of feedback, and in an update earlier this month, the committee concluded that the mechanisms aren't yet in place to support a mandate for universal data sharing. So there's an initial step towards this. From July next year, a data sharing statement will be required for all submitted clinical trial publications, which will indicate whether individual participant data will be shared, and if so, when and how. So that's an initial step, and it is noted that the editors may take data sharing statements into consideration when making editorial decisions. So on to a bit more detail about what the regulators are doing. The EMA first outlined steps towards proactive disclosure of data in an article published in 2012. Following a process of consultation, they published a policy on publication of clinical trial data in October 2014, and the first phase of that came into force in January 2015. So this provides access through an EMA portal to documents relating to submissions, which includes the individual study reports where personal data has been redacted, and also to supporting documents such as the protocol and amendments, the CRF and analysis plan, as well as to the clinical overview and summary. In a second phase, they're consulting with stakeholders currently to find the most appropriate way to make IPD available in compliance with privacy and data protection laws. Looking to the FDA, they've not announced currently any plans to proactively share individual patient-level data, but they're also taking seriously the need for increased transparency and the benefits of using individual patient data. So the posting requirements on clinicaltrials.gov have recently expanded to include the requirement for summary results for all secondary endpoints and for the posting of protocol and statistical analysis plans. Interestingly, in parallel with this, the National Institute of Health, which is a big funder of research in the US, has increased the scope of registration requirements for their funded research to include all clinical trials, with a very broad scope, including all phases and covering non-pharmacological therapies, such as behavioural interventions as well. Additionally, a group of international funding bodies, including WHO, MRC in the UK and others, have also announced a strengthening of registration and results posting requirements for all research supported by them. And the FDA are looking to use individual patient level data through a number of disease-specific activities that they've been launching. And finally, Health Canada have recently proposed proactive sharing of clinical trial reports, similar to the EMA's Policy 70. So in response to this pressure for increased transparency, the pharmaceutical industry have proactively put in place commitments for responsible sharing of clinical trial data along the lines that Janice outlined earlier. So in particular, individual patient data and supporting documents are being shared for use under approved research proposals reviewed by an independent panel, and that's being applied proactively to all medicines that are approved in the EU and US. So onto the specifics of what data may be available for use. Next slide, please. Interestingly, Rebecca and I first used a version of this slide in the very early days of discussion of data sharing, when we were trying to encourage people to be more specific about what they meant when they were discussing the potential benefits and issues of data sharing, because we hadn't even really clarified what we meant by data. It reminds me how much we've now moved on, because now really this is more informative about the whole range of data types that are being shared actively. And the main intention of this presentation is to encourage you to consider the benefits of accessing these data. And I've indicated on here the distinction between mainly aggregated sources of data, summary statistics, and individual patient level data. But for this audience, I don't think I need to go into details of defining those. So to overview the pros and cons of these general sources of data, overall, it's all about really the trade-off between the rich utility there is when we have patient-level data and the increased time that is generally needed to secure access to and understand and use that data. The need for a data sharing agreement and access controls so that individual patient data can be safely shared means that it takes some time for all the processes to be completed. And I think our ongoing experience is that will continue to be something that has to consume some time in order to make sure everything's properly in place. Whereas CSRs and other summary level data and supporting documents are now often freely available online. So first, we're going to consider use of access to detailed summary information that's available in CSRs. I'm sure that those of you who work in the pharmaceutical industry are already quite familiar with making the choice to use study reports. I often seek out information from internal study reports rather than attempting to access individual patient level data, because even internally that usually has quite a large resource and time implication to gain access and ensure that you sufficiently understand the data, often requiring replication of the original analyses before proceeding to any further analysis. So access to CSRs gives you all sorts of benefits that you'll be used to from internal reports, but you can now think about doing that more broadly across a whole range of sources, and that can open up a lot of ability to do broader meta-analyses using available summary statistics. Compared to publications, there's a lot more access to secondary and exploratory results. There may be more access to unpublished studies and negative studies than is available through publications. And all of these can help us to really better understand the details of the analysis methodologies and assumptions used, which are often really heavily summarised in publications. And the great benefit of that for us is that should lead to the design of more efficient trials, which is good for us and good for patients. So we can use these to inform the whole trial design, including populations, inclusion, exclusion criteria, endpoints and so on, as well as looking at sample size estimation specifically, where this information is often useful. So we've been looking for case studies of where people have been using this new access to increased information, and one that we're aware of is an interesting study where the EMA's provision of redacted CSRs on request was used. So a company were interested in a rare subgroup of a disease population, and they identified 4 studies that have been used for registration and had used the same control arm that they were interested in. They requested access to this and received it within 6 weeks, and they not only were able to confirm the sample size assumptions, ensuring that the trial was efficient, but additionally gained insights from the protocol amendments that had taken place in those studies, and access to really detailed information about the endpoint definitions for the efficacy analyses and the analysis population definitions. I think that's a really nice example of how that broadening access can help us, and how the systems really now have moved on to the point where it's really quite feasible to be thinking about routinely trying to access this broader information, because it is getting much easier. So resources of CSRs that are available. There's the basic summary level results still available from clinicaltrials.gov that go back quite a time. The EU portal that I've already mentioned, that's providing proactive sharing from 2015 of study reports, and also on request, as the example that I just mentioned. Companies are increasingly putting in place proactive sharing policies for CSRs. So a couple of examples of this are GSK, who've publicly posted study reports for interventional trials across phases 1 to 4 for their approved and terminated medicines dating back to the formation of their company in 2000. And Novo Nordisk, who are gradually making available the CSRs for phase 1 to 4 trials back to 2006 for their approved medicines. There are examples of companies that have proactive statements and portals where you can access their CSRs, but CSRs are generally now available on request from many companies as well. It may also be possible to gain access to this sort of information for academic studies, but my experience is the equivalent of such a full report might not be produced routinely for academic studies, and it may be more difficult to access these. But I think, again, there's a shift in the willingness to do this and the recognition of the value of this in academic institutions as well. So coming on to patient level data, it's interesting that a real driver for the push for increased transparency and access to data was the request for people to be able to independently replicate analyses that had been done. Interestingly, there hasn't been nearly as much interest as might have been anticipated once there are more data available, and I think the provision of transparent access to data should really help to shift perceptions so that there's no longer such worry about the need for independent replication, but that is a legitimate use of independent analysis and is being carried out some of the time. However, far more interest has focused on the ability of individual patient level data to really explore more deeply effects across trials using IPD meta-analyses, to use the data to sort of mine information that might help with consideration of new indications or new endpoints. This again might be used for sample sizing. We can use it to look at investigating prognostic factors and all sorts of ways in which we might want to consider how patients are most likely to provide different types of data, or even perhaps to have missing data, which will help us prospectively plan analyses better. And this might also be increasingly used in HTA analyses. There are broader benefits that could come from this wider use of data. It already appears that there's going to be better connections made across researchers and new collaborations coming out of this increased access. And in general, I think it's a positive thing that the research community are increasing their understanding of the complexity of the data sets that are generated in the pharmaceutical industry, with more appreciation of the size and complexity of their construction and of the amount of QC and audit that goes into those, and that's really, and the amount of work that goes into ensuring that good programming practice and statistical analysis practice in terms of pre-planned analyses and reporting of any deviations goes on. It's all much more transparent now than it was previously. However, as I said before, you'll appreciate it takes some time to get to grips with patient level data. So to give you some specific resources where you could go to look for IPD, there's a website where 13 different pharma companies are listing their studies that are available under their commitment to proactively provide access. And to date, over 3,000 studies have been listed on that. And there's an inquiry route for unlisted trials as well, so that you can request access, which will be considered in terms of the company's ability to make that data available. If the company is not one of those that get involved in that site, then they all have request processes in line with the SPA Pharma commitment. And I've actually found it really easy to access the arrangements to request data. If you go to the main corporate website for any of the pharma companies, then you can search quite quickly for data sharing, data transparency, clinical study results and things like that, and quickly get to a process where you can see what studies are available and make requests. And so there's examples here of a few companies that have specific request processes that involve some sort of online forms and request processes. Academic institutions may also have a process, but this may be harder to find and access. But there's a lot of discussion in these circles as well, and I know that processes are being proactively put into place. For instance, in UK clinical trial units, there's a big push towards having more systematic use of data sharing practices. It's also worth looking for specific resources in disease areas that you're interested in. So a good example of this is Project DataSphere, where nearly 100 oncology studies have been accessed with the control arm data provided from pharmaceutical companies, and those are openly available for use. So hopefully that gives you some idea of the wealth of resources that are available, and the fact that it really is realistic to try to involve a broad range of these sources in the future planning of trials, and you're not just restricted to resources available within your company. So I shall now hand over to Rebecca to finish our part of the talk.
Thanks, Sally. So I think you've heard from Sally about the wealth of information sources that are out there that we perhaps need to be thinking of when we're working as statisticians. What I just want to cover is perhaps some other ways we need to adapt and think about things in the light of this sort of transparency movement and arena. And as I said at the beginning, we need to really think that our documents are no longer just conversations with the regulators. We should now consider them, I think, public documents when we're writing our statistical analysis plans. And just to touch on a couple of things that Sally covered at the beginning is that, you know, ct.gov has now changed, and now there is an expectation that the protocol and statistical analysis plan will be submitted as part of your results postings from January this year. I think the other thing to bear in mind is the results postings. Previously, we were required to share our key secondary endpoints. We are now required to share all our secondary endpoints. So when you're designing a protocol and you maybe have put in your protocol 30 secondary endpoints, you've got to now think that all those 30 need to be reported. So really think when you're designing your trials, you know, exactly which endpoints you really need to pre-specify, bearing in mind that there'll be a ct.gov commitment at the end for both primary and secondary endpoints. And I think the other thing in terms of the ICMJE commitment around making patient-level data sharing as part of a publication, that mandate didn't come through in the final sort of writing of that, but there is again an expectation when you submit to major journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, like the Lancet, along with your publication, you'll be expected to have available your protocol and your statistical analysis plan. So again, that's another route whereby that information is both accessible to you, but you will also be sharing. Thinking a little bit about clinical study reports and policy 17, we heard from Janice and Nicola kind of the legal aspects of that and some of the ideas about, you know, risk quantification and the fact that there is no such thing as a truly anonymized data set in this current world, that we will in biostats, I think, need to get a bit more expertise in these anonymization techniques and risk quantification methodologies in such a way that we can develop scalable solutions for our studies and really have that whole idea that these documents will be ending up on the EMA portal kind of planned in from the very beginning. Do we need to be thinking about building very early on redaction ready document templates with that in mind? So I think there's a whole host of stuff falling out of policy 70 where our colleagues in regulatory and medical writing are really going to need our help as quantitative risk-based people to really help work out how some of these things are going to become a reality. And then just one of the other initial things that's in the EMA policy is also the expectation going forward that trial participants will receive a plain language summary of the trial that they've been involved in. And again, I think, you know, statistics may be able to help in terms of making sure that some of those plain language summaries still maintain a certain amount of statistical rigor, and I think there's going to be a real tension between what we consider to be statistically rigorous sentences and then perhaps being plain language for non-statisticians. So I think that's something else to bear in mind. And then I think finally, in terms of the way we work on our trials for our studies that we're on right now and the filings that we're on right now, I think, you know, a lot of times we're very much focused on the filing. We're very much trying to sort of focus on the right work and really be efficient with what we do. But I think we also need to have a bit of a conversation in our heads in that everything we do does need to be available in the future, perhaps for someone else's secondary research. And so really, are we in our processes and the way we're working right now really helping that in the future, both for ourselves and others, are the things we're doing easily findable? Will they be easily accessible? And then when we've got hold of those, how easy are those data sets going to be used? How can, are they going to be easily interoperable and perhaps, consistently modelled in the same way across the same trials in a particular group of indications, and are the programming codes that we've written, reusable by others, maybe another colleague in your organisation 2-3 years down the line who's working on a new compound. So I think we need to be really thinking about that rather than just what we're doing today. So finally, our kind of closing thoughts are really that that data sharing is a reality, and I think it's going to create masses of opportunities for us as statisticians and people generally working in sort of the quantitative science area, in that there are so many more insights out there that will really, I think, help us with our drug development thinking and strategy. And really, again, there's another big opportunity in terms of this whole quantitative risk methods for data privacy, getting us involved in helping with that. And I think going forward, I mean, we know how important statisticians are because we are statisticians, but I think going forward we have a real role to play in drug development, because we really need to be the ones that can help people know where the relevant data is, how to get to it, and then when we've got hold of it, how to then use it, analyze it for meaning, but then also be able to communicate those insights in a user-friendly and impactful way. And so I think the future's bright for statistics and statisticians, and I think it's just making sure that we are ready for that future. So so that was kind of the main sort of thrust of our presentation. There were just a couple of things I wanted to talk about that are coming up that we in the PSI data sharing working group have kind of got an eye on. There's a technical anonymization group that EMA are in the process of setting up. They've been calling for people to take part in that. So we're waiting to see who will be on that technical anonymization group and then the outputs of that group. And they're going to be very much thinking about some of these nuts and bolts issues around the Policy 70 anonymization issues. Within the data sharing working group ourselves, we're also looking at building on some initial information that was accumulated at a workshop that was organised by us in September last year. We're planning another workshop this year, which will again be a bit more of a deeper dive into focusing on strategies. That's still in the planning phase, so please watch this space, but there will be adverts for that in the future as our plans become more forthcoming. But at the moment, I think we're waiting to pivot that from when the TAG group kicks off, so that the two are somewhat connected. So really, that's all we have to share with you today. We would welcome your questions and comments. Alongside this deck, we have got a couple of pages of references as well. But maybe I'll pass it back to Ray now to see what questions we've had through the chat function. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for all the other speakers. First question: should patients be concerned about having their data made available? I think that could be to either set of presenters.
I don't know who wants to go first. Let's go, Nicola.
Yeah, I mean, I fully understand that it can be a concern from the patients, obviously, since it's crucial that their data will be protected. But it's what I said before. So it's important in order to be able to reply to this right question, to create a fully reliable and transparent approach, meaning clear rules and clear roles on who is doing what in the company and outside the company, meaning also the platform hosting, I would say, the entity hosting the platform, since it's important that the process from end to end will be absolutely safe for the patient and reliable for any use of the data.
And to add to that, I know, with the informed consent process that is in play for any person wanting to enroll in a clinical trial, generally these days that informed consent will include statements about how that data could be reused. So I guess if patients do have concerns, that will be, that will be written up as part of the consent process. So I guess potentially they may choose not to consent. But I think in terms of some of the other meetings I've been at and meetings I've listened to where patient advocates have been part of the conversation, I think there's very much a feeling when patients do choose to contribute to clinical trials, they do it for purely altruistic reasons and really for the benefit of other patients and society. And generally their feeling is they would welcome their data to be reused and used in as many ways as possible and as many insights generated from it, because I think that's, you know, that's what they're giving their data for. But you've also got the informed consent angle as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. How much impact will the new data protection regulation next year have on this?
Yes, I mean the new data protection regulation will is focused really on individuals and individual rights, is creating a clear obligation for data controller and also data processor, and it also makes clear that anonymized data are not considered under data protection regulation. So again, it's important that until when we deal with individual data, we will protect the data at the highest possible level. In both cases, if we are dealing with them directly, if we are dealing with data using also vendors or in general third parties. Then when we are moving to the use of the processing really of anonymized data, again, it's important to focus on the process, and it's important to focus on the assessment for the anonymization process and the regular reassessment of these data sets, since obviously we have always to consider and measure the risk of identification. So the GDPR is increasing responsibility and accountability of all entities processing personal data. And then it will become really important to be able to show to authority internally and also to the general public exactly how we are going to manage the data.
Thank you. What would be the penalty from the EMA or FDA if all the secondary objectives were not reported?
So I think that both the EMA and certainly the FDA do have financial penalties that they can apply in those situations. However, it's actually the reputational impact that companies will be concerned about. And because of this, I think they're trying really hard to make sure they do meet the requirements and making sure that they negotiate and inform authorities when there are any issues that prevent them from timely reporting. It's interesting that a number of external bodies are starting to really monitor now what pharma companies are reporting compared to what they registered. So the completeness of that, and there's a couple of references in the slide deck to some studies looking at that completeness. And so really it's that naming and shaming that's going to happen that is the big penalty, I think, that companies should be concerned about, and which will really drive good practice in this area. And I know that in the UK, the ABPI have been very helpful in looking into this as well, and supporting companies in making sure that they're not only meeting the requirements from their own point of view, but they're being seen to meet the requirements from any external perspective.
Thank you. What should a default data sharing agreement include? What criteria would be included when writing the agreement for secondary research?
This is Rebecca. I can go for this first and then see what Nicola says from a legal perspective. But I'm part of, well, Roche are part of clinicalstudyDataRequest.com, And as a set of 13 companies, we have come up with a data sharing agreement that works on that website. And if you're starting from scratch, I would say go to have a look at that website, because the template data sharing agreement is available as a click-through. You don't need to log on to the site. It's very visible. So you could have a look at that. I mean, that's obviously been written in the context of the data sharing through that group, which is through a secure analysis portal. But the key things are around, you know, a commitment to do the analyses that you pre-specified in your research proposal, a commitment not to attempt to re-identify patients. In our case, it's a commitment to publish as well, any insights, or if you find any insights you think might be, you know, maybe a safety issue, you must then, you know, communicate back to the data generating company and potentially the health authorities and things like that. And if it's a scenario whereby you're physically giving a copy of the data sets to that research group, I think there should be some statements in there about the security systems of that organisation that will be holding the data, some expectations of minimum security, and maybe a commitment to destroy that data after a period of time. And I don't know, Nicola, if there's any other key ones that you
maybe just one more is not to share the data further.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, but as Rebecca said, the template is available in.
Yeah. So if the person asked that question is got a blank piece of paper, and I would say have a look at that first, because that might inspire some thoughts and help.
Okay, thank you. Do we need patient consent for data sharing of this kind? And I have to say, from my own ASAL experience, the answer is yes, but I'll open for more comprehensive response.
So, I mean, you have the, as Rebecca alluded to, many companies now are including a statement in their informed consent forms about the future use of data. So most likely it's covered there. However, I think it's very important to note that from, and maybe Nicola can add to that, but from the data privacy perspective, once you anonymize the data, then it's no longer deemed personal data, and so it's no issue at all if it's properly anonymized. And I think it was that important point that Nicola mentioned in the orange box, if it's correct, correctly anonymized.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's important to first of all to have a clear, rule for the anonymization. Then data are out of the privacy, an application of privacy rules. But what is important, I think we have all said, the focus on the same point is that it's important to be transparent in terms of information to the patients and make clear what will happen to data in a general way, I would say, maybe even after the anonymization.
Thank you. Are there timelines for reporting? How long after the trial has been completed does it have to be reported?
If we're talking about in the context of the registries, so things like ct.gov, then yes, there are timelines. And I think it's 12 months after the CSR, the last patient, last visit, for ct.gov. And I think it might be quicker for paediatric trials. So there are definitely timelines, but I wasn't sure if that question is alluding to that or timelines around patient level data sharing.
Yeah, maybe in terms of the initiatives various companies take out of their own incentive to share data, then that will be the company will decide the timeline, so there are no timelines there.
Yeah.
Then in terms of policy 0070, I think, the actual implementation, although it was valid from 2015, the implementation only started 2017, and so there is a backlog. But again, on the EMA website, you'll see their planned timeline, what it would be in the future. But right now, you have a substantial backlog from the opinion given until the release. So I think there's about 10 or 12 publicly released now on the portal, but you can check it there,
And I guess in terms of data sets from companies, as Janice said, every organisation has its own set of standards, but generally speaking, most companies say they will share patient level data and I think this is part of the FPA Pharma principles as well, is only when approval has been achieved for that particular drug and indication in both the EU and the US. That's sort of generally the starting point for being able to request individual patient level data from a clinical trial. Hopefully that's covered all the possibilities for that question.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. Question not from a small company point of view, without extensive resources, how will they deal with this?
So I guess regardless of the size of the company, for data sharing through ct.gov and UDRA-CT, that is mandatory. I guess there are CROs and so on that can help and facilitate that. Then voluntary sharing is entirely up to the companies themselves. And finally, for policy 0070, I think it's actually mentioned in the policy or some of the accompanying documents that for smaller companies, the EMA would work with a vendor or something to help smaller companies. So I think the EMA would be open to some discussion there, is my understanding. But I don't know the details of that. I don't know if any of the other speakers know the details, but it's mentioned in the policy.
Potentially associated question, do terminated programs have to be made available?
So for policy 70, it's the opinion, the European opinion. So that's whether it's a negative opinion or positive opinion. So indeed, yes, negative studies or outcomes of submissions would be made public. I'm assuming for companies, for voluntary data sharing, it's their own decision. I guess maybe a personal view, it doesn't look very transparent if we only share the positive studies. So it's something to consider, but of course it would be the company's own policy. And then for UDRA-CT and ct.gov, it's all trials, regardless of whether they're positive or negative.
Exactly. And I do think that the challenge in the past for terminated drugs or development programs has sometimes been that maybe that particular asset is then divested to another organisation, so that kind of adds a level of complexity, or maybe there's been a termination for a particular indication but it's still ongoing in others. So I think many companies do have sentences around they will share negative trials and or terminated development programs, but sometimes the devil's in the detail as to when exactly that can happen.
Mm-hmm. There are no further questions, but if I can just ask one. With the various industry groups that are looking at this in all its various ways, how do they work together? What linkages are there between these different groups?
Well, I guess the PSI data sharing working group is one of those linkages, and so that's an opportunity, I think, for again, as part of this webinar, is to try and then share that with the wider pharmaceutical community. I know that FPA, so the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries, they talk about these things and think about these things. I don't know if Nicola, have you got any comments from that, from the sort of the policy 70 legal perspective? So there are those organisations. I think also, I don't know if it's Sally or Janice mentioned FUSE, so the programming kind of cross-organisational group. So there are a number of places where people get together, because fundamentally we're all facing this problem together and all trying to solve something we haven't had to solve before. So there are lots of benefits of sharing knowledge, experience, and how to sort of tackle this.
Yeah, and in terms of the review period of Policy 70 and the many webinars, I mean, PSI and FPA had a team of people there, and there were some face-to-face meetings with the EMA, and some of us had the possibility as FPA members to attend that. So there is a link. It doesn't mean to say, Ray, that there couldn't be some small body somewhere doing some work in isolation, because it's hard to keep in contact. But as Rebecca said, FUSE, there's another organisation, Transcelerate, has done quite a bit of work, and we have members within this working group that are also involved there. So we try to have inputs and outputs from the PSI group.
And I think it's a very important opportunity, the technical anonymization group, since it is where, I mean, at least it is my expectation, we will have all the players sitting at the same table, including, I would say, also patient association, why not? And then it will be a way to share different ideas, to have challenges, but finally I hope to find a common way to move forward with some anonymization approach.
Excellent, thank you. If we go down to the last slide. So thanks to all the presenters. I hope the attendees have found this an interesting session. As I say, it has been recorded and will be available, so if you wish to list again or send it to your colleagues so they can have the pleasure of going through it. PSI and EFSPI run a number of webinars and other things, so some of the recent ones, the ones that are coming up soon, are up on the screen. There's also the PSI Journal Club, which there's another one coming in July. If you're not a member of PSI, go on our website. You can sign up for a fortnightly email with updates of what we're doing. So my thanks to all the presenters for a very interesting session, and thanks to all the attendees. So we can now close a little bit before the scheduled time. So thanks to everyone and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.